Good morning, everyone. I'm Sandra Bass. I'm the Senior Associate Dean of Students and Executive Director of the Public Service Center at UC Berkeley. And it is a pleasure for you to join us. I'm honored to be with you here today with our two esteemed guests, Riane Eisler and Belvie Rooks. You know, we began planning this conversation with Riane and Belvie several months ago, long before these tragic events in Israel and Gaza began to unfold, because has been clear and has been clear for many years now that our global human community is moving towards several pivotal choice points. Will we choose democracy or autocracy? Will we shift towards building a more just and sustainable society, or continue exacerbating our climate crisis and its related social upheavals? Will we embrace inclusivity or divisiveness, love or hate? Sadly, we have been at similar choice points before, and both Riane and Belvie have borne witness to the harms of racist authoritarian beliefs and regimes, and those experiences led each of them to embark on their lifelong journeys to understand the systems that were perpetuating harm and to advocate for more inclusive and life-affirming ways for us to move forward. They also have known each other for decades, and I must tell you, it has been such a privilege to be in conversation with them as we prepared this conversation. And I say this with all sincerity, my gratitude to both of them for giving me just a window into how they think. And we're really excited to thinking about what this conversation will evolve into today. Since we only have a short time together, I'm going to ask people to put your questions in the chat as we go along, and then I will pull those up later in our time together. They both have long bios and many accomplishments, and so near the end of our time together, I'm going to drop a Google Doc into the chat with their full bios and contact information. However, let me just briefly introduce both of them to you. For Belvie, meeting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a teenager at a weekend high school retreat had a profoundly lasting and transformative impact on her understanding of and commitment to human rights and social justice. Shortly after that encounter, one of her first political acts was to help organize picket lines in the Bay Area in solidarity with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee efforts in the South. This then led her to be involved in numerous social movements, including several organizing and leadership roles in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and several sub-Saharan African countries. Belvie is an essayist and educator whose work weaves the worlds of spirituality, feminism, and ecology. She and her late husband, Didon Gills Jr., were partners in love and life, who centered the mentoring of future social justice leaders. And many of those young people have become thought leaders in their own right, including her daughter, Belvie Rooks, who is professor and chair of Africana Studies at Brown University. A defining moment in Riane's young life was Kristall Night in Vienna after the Nazis took power. This night is enshrined in our historical memory because of all the glass broken in Jewish homes and synagogues. It was the night that Riane watched her father dragged off by the Nazis. But she not only saw violence and injustice that night, she also witnessed what she later called spiritual courage, when her mother risked her life to eventually obtain Riane's father's release. These early experiences led to the questions that years later animated her pioneering life work, identifying, defining, and deconstructing domination systems and partnership systems. Work so relevant for our challenging times. Her life was also fundamentally altered by meeting and living with her late husband, social scientist and writer David Loy. Riane credits David, who shared her vision, for his inspiration and support of her work, and for much of what she learned in her personal life journey. So a warm welcome to each of you.
Thank you so much.
So I wanted to start off first, Riane, by expressing my compassion for you and the extended Jewish community in this extraordinarily difficult and tragic time. And as we just learned, you were born in Vienna, and your father's arrest by the Nazis and your mother's courageous efforts to free him were a defining moment in your childhood. Can you take us back to that moment, what you were thinking and feeling as a child, and how that later informed your work?
Thank you so much, Sandra. And it's a pleasure to be with you and with Belvie and with all of you this morning. But it's morning here in where I am in California. Yes, as Sandra said, I was born in Vienna, and my childhood was really not exceptional in any way. We lived right by the Danube. My parents wanted me to learn English. I really think that they were very prescient. And so they sent me to a bilingual kindergarten, the head of which was a woman who got killed, actually, on Crystal Night. And it was, as Sandra said, it was Crystal Night that really was very traumatic in my young life. I had already seen how after the Anschluss, the joining of Austria to Nazi Germany, old Jews with beards were forced to really clean the sidewalks near the quay, near the place where we lived, and people laughed. And Mitzi, who took care of me, there was a law passed that Gentiles could not work for Jews, so she left. And that was pretty traumatic, but it was really Crystal Night that was the trauma, where I watched a gang of Gestapo men break into our home and drag my father away. And as Sandra said, I also saw something else that night, what I today call spiritual courage. We've been taught courage is slaying the dragon or killing the enemy, but this was a different kind of courage, and my mother displayed it. It was the courage to stand up against injustice out of love. Now, she could have been killed. A lot of Jewish people were killed that night. She recognized one of the men as the former errand boy in the family business, and she got furious. She said, "How dare you do this to this man who has been so kind to you? I want him back." And by a miracle, yes, some money passed hands eventually. She did get him back, and if she hadn't, we would have stayed vainly waiting for him to be released, of course, from a concentration camp. And we too would have been one of the 6 million Jews who were killed by the Nazis in an era in Europe when, as today, there was a great deal of anti-Semitism. And by another miracle, my parents were able to purchase an entry permit to Cuba, which was one of the very few places that allowed people fleeing what we didn't realize at the time, the Holocaust, but fleeing the Nazis, fleeing the anti-Semitism, which wasn't only the Nazis. It was people who had been misled to think that Jews all deserve to be killed, like we hear today. We were able to leave Vienna in the middle of the night by train. And in fact, there was a Scientific American article just came out a few weeks ago of an interview with me where I really talk about that. But anyway, I grew up in the industrial slums of Havana, where I witnessed another injustice. and experienced it, the tremendous poverty all around us compared to at that time in Cuba with the enormous wealth of those on top. And to make a long story short, all these experiences led me to questions, as Sandra said, questions like, why, when we humans have such enormous capacities for caring, for consciousness, for creativity, what I saw in my mother and my parents, why has there been so much cruelty, so much indifference and insensitivity, so much violence? Is it, as we're often told, inevitable, original sin, selfish genes? They're the same story. They fight each other, but it's really the same story. We're bad. We need to be rigidly controlled from the top, right? Or is there an alternative? And yes, my work was designed to answer that question. And the answer is a resounding yes, but we can't see this alternative through the conventional lenses of right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, because they fragment our consciousness. And not only that, they marginalize or ignore nothing less than the majority of humanity, women and children. So I'm going to stop in just a minute, but looking at the whole system, which is what my multidisciplinary, cross-cultural, transhistorical, because I also look at prehistory, really took into account, is the whole picture. And once you do that, you begin to see patterns which repeat themselves cross-culturally, historically. And there were no names, so I called one the domination system. We're all familiar with it. You better do as those on top tell you to do, or else there's going to be a lot of pain, even death. Or the partnership model. And that introduction of a new paradigm, of a new approach, is today, I think, more urgent than ever before. And I'll stop at this point, because although I didn't look at the watch, I have a feeling I went on a little longer than I thought.
But so rich, so much there. And, it's interesting turning to you now, Belvie, that you also had pivotal moments in your childhood that led you on your life journey. You've written about your sense of isolation you felt as a child, to the point where at one point you considered suicide. And then you had this extraordinary transformative weekend with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So I want you to take us back to that experience, that moment when you chose to live, and how your encounter with Dr. King changed your life forever.
Yes, thank you, Sandra. It's interesting because I've only recently spoken publicly about my 14, 15-year-old experience of standing in a bathroom with a fistful of rat poison and water, just really wanting this to be over. And I decided I was not being honest when I spoke so much now and pointed to the suicide rates that are happening now. In fact, between age 10 and 14, suicide is the 5th largest cause of death in the United States. And I was speaking to it without really being honest and saying I understood it. I not shared my experience. And so I didn't actually in that moment choose to live. I realized as I was getting ready to, a door slammed in the house, and I realized I was not alone as I had thought that I was. And so I quickly put everything away to come back again. And fortunately I did not. But that was as a 15-year-old. As a 16-year-old, I mean, and part of my despair was that I was adopted into my family of birth, and I always felt like I didn't belong. And I clearly didn't. And so it was a very painful time. Just through a series of synchronicities, I was invited as a 16-year-old. I grew up in San Francisco, went to high school, Polytechnic High School, and I had a friend who was a Quaker, you know, her parents were Quakers, and so I kind of hung out with her. And I got invited to a conference in which this young minister was going to be the featured speaker. We'd never heard of him. I was, and 400 high school students from all over California were gonna have an opportunity to come to Asilomar, spend 3 days, one extra day, so when you didn't have to go to school, with this young minister. I had a little, and that was a 29-year-old Dr. King. And I've written about this, so I will just, you know, I think in the interest of time, I'll read the paragraph that will, and I just want to say that two of the other things that happened was on the bus going down to Asilomar, there was a young woman with a guitar who was as big as she was, who got on the bus, and her name was Joan. We hung out in the back of the bus. We sang Pete Seeger and folk songs. And the irony was that at that point, the civil rights movement and young people in the South were struggling to be able to sit wherever they wanted. And we were clear, all the cool people were in the back of the bus hanging out and singing. It was a huge surprise for all of us that before Dr. King was announced, as he was being announced and would speak, Joan Baez came out and opened for him. That, I understand, was one of her first public and her largest gathering at that point. And then the moment that we'd all been waiting for arrived. A very young Dr. King walked to the podium. He was 29 years old. Because he was so young, his message seemed very accessible, and we listened intently as he talked to us about the incredible courage of young people our age in the South, and the risks that they were taking and the dangers they faced willingly to make the world a better place. He talked about Gandhi and the creative power of nonviolence. He talked about the redemptive power of love and how truth, goodness, righteousness, and love would always win out in the end. He talked about personal responsibility and the power that we each had to make a difference. I remember vividly how at the end of his speech, he not only got a standing ovation, but we were on our feet and we were yelling and we were screaming and we were holding each other and we were crying. He had spoken to our hearts. He spoke to our unformed visions of hope and possibility for the world. He appealed to our sense of fairness and justice. And he said, as part of his closing, that we were special. But we were special not in an elitist sense. He made us feel that we were special because he knew, he said, he could count on us to love a better world into existence. And I'll just kind of wrap that up by saying there is nothing like having 400 young people who have both found each other and a purpose in this 4 days. So crying, nobody wanted to get on the bus that they came on. Nobody wanted to leave. We were crying. We were holding each other. We were at the wrong bus. And we cried and carried on all the way from Asilomar to San Francisco. And that's why I say there's nothing, you know, a bunch of teenagers who found a purpose and friends, and now they've got to go back to a high school where nobody knows or understands anything about this transformative experience. And fortunately, and I'll, you know, wrap up in saying, because it's been informed so much of the work that Didan and I have done, the work that I did before. Fortunately, the Quaker hosts and mentors on that journey with us by the time we got to San Francisco, they had said and communicated and told us that we would be together for a year, that we were going to be a group. And so every other month we met, we sat in circle, we talked, we did some community cleanup at the beach. But the most important thing, and the Quakers folks focus a lot on silence, the most important things were the circles that we sat in and talked to each other. It was a safe place based on the experience that we had. We spoke from the heart. We spoke of our fears, and we were a very diverse group. So in that context, for me, diversity was a great thing because it just made you more interesting for me. And I'll just kind of wrap up and close with that for now. But it was a powerfully transformative moment. And part of what Dr. King said as he closed, hate only intensifies hate in the world. Someone has to break the chain. Hate for hate ends in destruction. And that feels particularly relevant now. And an important part of that is someone has to. And I think we left feeling that we were part of the someone.
That's just beautiful. Thank you both. And listening to you speak, it's so clear that you have touched history and been touched by history. And as we were prepping for this conversation, one of the things that both of you brought up was we are missing critical connections. We're not connecting the dots in terms of what's happening now and why. And so we're really missing what this moment is and why it's so critical. So Riane, can you just share a little bit about what you were thinking about when you brought that up?
Well, as I said earlier, it became very clear to me, and I should say that when I embarked on this multidisciplinary cross-cultural research, I had already experienced another pivotal experience in my life. Yes, being born Jewish had almost cost me my life. I was a refugee child from the Holocaust, of course, but I also realized, along with thousands of other women, that having been born female had really impacted my life as well, my life choices, even how I saw myself. So I already had feminism. And so naturally, in The Chalice and the Blade, which, by the way, is now in its 57th printing, I think, in the United States, and in about 30 foreign editions, I try to understand, how did we get to this awful place? And the book ends with 2 chapters, breakdown of evolution and breakthrough in evolution. So I think that it was really, I sometimes talk about my life like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle coming together. But the truth of the matter is that so is history and prehistory and our whole cultural evolution on this beautiful planet of ours. And the studies that we have all been taught, and the more, quote, educated we are, the more we've been taught this version of history, by leaving out the majority of humanity, women and children, leaving out that huge piece of prehistory, where we know now from archaeology, from mythology, even from DNA studies, that our initial cultural evolution in the mainstream of civilization was really more in a partnership direction rather than in a domination direction. This makes it impossible for us to do what Belvie talked about, what you talked about, Sandra, which is to really connect the dots. And domination systems are based on in-group versus out-group thinking and acting. But it starts actually in people's family, this denial. And again, I refer you to the Scientific American article that just came out about this, on how do traumas really originate. And domination systems are trauma factories. It starts in a highly punitive, rigidly male-dominated, authoritarian family, which just a few generations ago was really the ideal norm and still is, for not only for people in the United States, a huge segment of people, but globally. I mean, and what we are seeing is also because of our economic system, which is domination economics, whether it's very old, you know, happened after the shift to domination from partnership in our prehistory, which was a very gradual shift. And it really had a lot to do with remything. Yes, it started with violence, as we know today from DNA studies. But it was completed, if indeed it was ever completely completed, because there, generation after generation, there are some people, even people born into these punitive families, who don't go into denial, whether it's climate change denial or election result denial or denial of the Holocaust or denial. I mean, this thing about slavery is really beneficial. You know, I mean, that kind of insane denial. But it also is perpetuated by domination economics, where trauma is created by poverty, by lack of resources, by misdistribution of resources, not only to those on top, but also into weaponry, into warfare, and destruction. So my whole life really has been to try to not only to understand how we got here, but my subsequent books, starting with the next book, Sacred Pleasure, which is a heresy in itself, because domination systems are really held together by fear of pain. You know, you better do as you're told, or else there's going to be a lot of pain, even death. I'm trying to understand, what do we need to do to change this? And there are many trends in the partnership direction today, but they're all disconnected. I mean, the civil rights movement is here, the environmental movement is there, the movement against domestic violence and for human rights of women is over here. But they're all part of the movement towards a partnership system. And my work is really to help people connect the dots and to, in addition to whatever tactics we are using, and there are lots of them, to also focus on 4 cornerstones, which are foundational to either domination, the domination side, or the partnership side of the partnership domination social scale. The first is childhood and family. Did you know that Putin actually reduced the penalty for family violence in Russia? Yes, he gets it. You know, if you kill or harm a child or a woman or a man in your family, the penalty is lower than if you kill or harm a stranger. He gets the connection between a top-down, highly punitive, often violent, rigidly male-dominated family and that kind of state or tribe. We have to connect the dots. The second is gender, and we have inherited a hidden system of gendered values where there's always weapons, you know, money for prisons, you know, the male, punitive male head of household, right? That's what that is. But somehow there isn't enough money for caring for children, for nurturing children, for feeding children, especially children of the quote out group, whether it's a different race, a different religion, whether it's Shia versus Sunni or Sunni versus Shia in the Middle East, whether it's anti-Semitism, it doesn't really matter. So we've got to pay attention to this hidden subtext of gender, because it's a key social, family, and economic organizing principle. Of course, the third is economics, and I wrote a whole book on that, The Real Wealth of Nations, and then story and language, because a lot of the stories that we've been told are false, like the story of the caveman cartoon, right? In one hand, he's got a weapon, other hand, he's dragging a woman by the hair. And we think nothing of showing this to children before their brains are, much less their critical faculties, are formed. And no, it's a lie. There is nothing in the art of the Paleolithic or the Neolithic, even the early Neolithic, of course, even remotely suggesting this. And again, I'm going to stop because I get into this and I want to cover everything and I can't. So
no, it's fascinating, and I really appreciate you mapping that out. And I want to pick up a thread, and Belvie, of course, anything that Riane spoke to, please speak to that as well. But this question of denial, and the denial of history, and I know that came up in our conversation. So Belvie, I don't know if you wanted to pick up that thread or anything else you think that we're missing.
I definitely, because this is the second conversation that Riane and I have had. I think the last one was probably 10 or 12 years ago. So, thank you. I can always, when we're hanging out, listening, exchanging. I just want to say that growing up and visiting the South from California when I was a little girl, and having, the family members all follow me around when we would, as an 11-year-old, so that I didn't drink at the wrong fountain, and everybody would end up in jail. And so, and then having experience with Dr. King, and having a kind of understanding of what was required in terms of pushing back, in terms of redefining, in terms of self-acceptance, in terms of, embracing a larger sense of community. And I think the Quakers and the post-Dr. King era was very instrumental for me in coming to understand that family, and that's what the Quaker circles meant for me, family does not always look the way we were raised to believe it was supposed to look. And I'll just say that again, that for me, family does not always look the way I was raised to believe it was supposed to look. And so what it meant for me when I met people like Edgar Mitchell, the 6th human to walk on the moon, and was invited to be on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, based on his understanding, the shift in understanding in his reality when he was coming back to Earth from deep space. And we had several conversations about this. And you can imagine just the depth of space, the darkness, and to suddenly see this beautiful small blue planet, blue, with some, white clouds. And he says that he went to space as a scientist and he came back as a mystic, in the sense that when he saw that, and he never shared that with NASA, of course, because it probably was lightning, but what he saw was a flash of light, which for him in that moment, he understood that could be a bomb, that could be a war, those could be, and he broke into tears. And his question was, When are they going to learn to stop causing each other so much suffering? And I feel that often we don't connect across the various divides, because Dr. King, that was the same conversation. When he got the Nobel Prize, the speech that he gave was, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? That, at this particular historical moment, is relevant. And as relevant as it was in 1964 when he delivered the speech. And when and it was called World House because he basically asked us to imagine that we had been gifted a house. A widely separated family inherits a house in which they have to live together. This is the great new problem of humankind. We have inherited a large house, a great house, a world house, in which we have to learn together, live together, Black and white, Eastern or Western, Gentile, Jew, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Hindu. Because if we don't, we can't survive. But people don't connect Edgar Mitchell and Dr. King because of the divide. And so when I think about connecting, what's been particularly transformative for me was home. We tend to think of home as a street that we live on. What Edgar contributes is everything he knew was in this small blue planet. That was home. 59th Street was where our house is. But we kind of, given the consciousness, don't have an understanding of the collectivity of who we in fact are.
That was so powerful. I want to just remind folks to put their questions in the chat. I have so many thoughts running through, but you know what I'd like to do next before we open it up for questions is both of you have spoken about your loving partnerships with your husbands, who were partners on every dimensions, and both poets. And I know that Didon passed away, Belvie's husband, a few years ago. I think, Riane, your husband passed away more recently, David. And you both wanted to share a short poem from your husbands, and then just talk about what that partnership meant to the evolution of your thought and your work. So Belvie, would you like to start?
I'll start. I'll tell you the name of this poem after I read it. It's very short. The falling leaf, the cloudless sky, the fleeting deer, the crow's distant cry. A forest green with mountain spring, a silent flutter of an iridescent wing. You who love the Hindywood trees, you who celebrate the morning sea. Amidst the sparkle of morning dew, I kiss the wildness in me inspired by you. Thank you, for it was you and you alone who helped my wildness find its home. It's been called. Thank you, Belvie.
Thank you, Belvie. Riane, would you like to share a poem by David?
Of course. David wrote me hundreds of poems. He always wrote a poem for the day that we met and became inseparable. And he even, just days before he died, just sort of right after our 45th year together, wrote me a poem. But I want to really read a very short poem, which in a sense is about, well, it's about love. and how love remains. Tomorrow, let's go again while the earth is wet. This you said to me last night after we had spent our third day gardening together. What a simple thing, yet how profoundly important. To get out of our separate driven heads, alternating between the ecstasy of scaling the mightiest of mountains and despair over whether an ounce of this will ever matter, and just be together. Tomorrow, let's go again while the earth is wet. Yes, let's go again, and then again to wherever life is simple, real, restorative. After all, what is it that in the end will matter? Only that we found each other and shared these years.
That's both of you. Yeah, just so beautiful. Would either of you want to speak to how these partnerships were so deeply influential in the evolution of your thinking and your work?
Belvie?
I think I would, except I realize we're about out of time.
Yeah, we've just got a couple.
I know
I want to make sure we get to some of the questions.
Get a couple of questions in too, but I just can't imagine. My own consciousness was greatly expanded by having someone who could see me, who could really see me.
Mm,
You know,
Thank you.
Deep gratitude I have.
And I will say the same. And David, of course, who had a PhD in social psychology, was also an in-house mentor and editor. And he really not only saw me, but he fully supported this work. In fact, when we went to the women's conference in 85 in Nairobi, Kenya, he was on the only panel of what men can do to advance the women's movement, which he saw. And if I may, I just want to, for a moment, address the question of denial, because and in-group versus out-group thinking, because they're completely interconnected. When a child is caused pain, it cannot, it's very dangerous, really, because it depends on those who are causing the pain for food, for shelter, for life. So, but that child is also told that it is the fault of an out group, right? That leads to complete denial, and it becomes built into the dominator psyche. So you have a system that is based on denial of reality. And what we need to do, and it's a system that has really is right side up, well, it's right side not down, really. We have to turn it around. And that is the movement from domination to partnership.
Right. Well, we're getting, some people are putting in the chat, if you get a chance to see just how touched they are by both of those poems. Or thank you so much for sharing them. So one question we got, are either of you familiar with the work of Maria
Gimbutas?
Ah, thank you. How has she influenced either of you in your studies over the years?
Well, she certainly influenced me, because although I draw from other archaeologists, and today, of course, there are, I mean, there's a film being made about my life and my work that interviews Ian Hoddard, who is the last archaeologist to excavate Çatalhöyük, which he says was a Gadlanic, a partnership culture. This was early Neolithic. But Maria Gimbutas is being today verified that, at least in Europe, the shift from a partnership direction to a domination direction was caused by the invasions, migrations of nomadic people who really, whose deity was hate and force. And that is something that we have to understand, that, and these were pastoral people rather than farming people. So we have to understand that. But she, and when she learned of my work, she said, now I can die because somebody understands my work. When she read the chalice, pieces of the chalice and the blade.
Wonderful. So another question we have here is, where do we go from here? Isn't that the big question? What can we do as individuals?
My goodness.
Well, actually, I'll just say briefly, what's hopeful, because where do we go from here? You know, for me is to focus on what's hopeful. And what's hopeful is, in terms of the intergenerational wisdom sharing dialogue circles, there are just some amazing things that are happening. And one of the things that I had to tell my grandson once, to turn off the television, because their news, as Alice Walker says in one of her poems, their news is not the news. And part of the news for me, it's just what's working, what's positive. And yeah, I spent time with a wonderful group that Didan was a founding board member of, Seeds, the Seeds Institute, doing amazing work with young people in high school. And in fact, an 11-year-old, and I will close with this, an 11-year-old child in Marin County just last week read one of Didan's poems and wrote her response to the poem. And 11-year-old, she calls it Rising Hope. Hope on the rise, whispering through the skies, hidden in the tides. Can you see the light of Didan standing up to make a difference? We can achieve our goals, we can patch the holes, we can heal our souls if we work together. And once I got over the tears at, this legacy, this is a child. And, Dr. Miller and Dr. Davis, and what they represent is what those adults represented for us on that bus when we were devastated and didn't know what to do. And they said, we will be in circle with you. We will listen to you. And so the listening is what produces these kinds of poems. And I'll close by saying, Liz often tells me, I get this call, she gets these calls from these parents that say, I know my child did not write that, and that you wrote it for them or somebody. And she would say, I haven't even put a comma. So I am really hopeful. This is an 11-year-old young white child in Marin paying homage to who would be a 78-year-old African-American man from LA who grew up in Watts. So reaching across those kinds of divides, and it's what's hopeful.
Thank you, Belvie. Any thoughts on that, Riane?
Oh, well, there's so much. I mean, I think that when you get right down to it, of course, whether it's the Taliban or whether, religious Eastern, or whether it is Putin in Russia now, or Hitler in Nazi Germany, they all, the commonality is this partnership ranking and the in-group versus out-group thinking, starting with really this model of our species, where the difference in form between female and male, and of course today we know that these are domination stereotypes, really, but domination systems have very rigid gender stereotypes. That is very fundamental to both the domination and the partnership system, but in very different ways. So, I mean, to have this child reach out and not think of in-group versus out-group and really identify and respond, that is a sign of hope, isn't it?
Yes.
But, you know, and so is the fact that we're talking a lot about trauma today, which we didn't, trust me. You know, I mean, this is a recent phenomenon. There are lots of trends, but again, I really want to talk about one thing because it's right there on the chat. Jackie Schoner's comment about Sarah Pertl, because I wrote a book on partnership education called Tomorrow's Children, and Sarah actually wrote a book about how to apply that to teaching. And Sarah Pertl, yes, she was referring to the idea of linking together versus ranking one another. This is fundamental, but it is impossible in domination systems, which depend on this denial and depend on trauma. As I said, they're trauma factories. So we have to go deeper and really understand, as I said to the United Nations General Assembly in talking about harmony with nature, you can't just tack on harmony with nature to a fundamentally imbalanced system. It isn't going to stick. It can be, you know, taken off just with the stroke of a pen by some guy on top, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're really getting tight on time. I had one quick follow-up question around global consciousness, because I'm hearing from both of you a recognition and understanding of how we are so deeply interconnected and interdependent that even children see this. And yet, as we age and become a part of this society, it's hard to hold on to that consciousness and to live into that. So I don't know if either of you had some words of wisdom on living into this larger global consciousness that we need to survive as a human community.
I'm not sure I would, you know, it's a wise wisdom that I'm sharing, but what comes up for me is I feel like we have to spend more time talking about and projecting what's working. Because, you know, and that's, you know, I have had this conversation with my grandson when he was little, and he'd come in and watch the news, and so why isn't what's working given more time and air and credence? In fact, what I said to him in that hour that you have been watching CNN and you're now very upset, just in this neighborhood alone, 100 people have done kind things. That is not the news, because that does not sell. So I really am just concerned about why it is, and in the midst of all of these amazing and wonderful things and partnership examples, we actually end up having to spend most of the time about what's not working. And I'll just close by saying that when I was doing, you know, marketing, book publishing and stuff, we never cared. I mean, if we got a New York Times review, that was great. We didn't really care whether it was positive or negative, and it was a negative, positive, it was wonderful, because people don't remember whether it was positive and that, they just remember the name. And in this country, we call the name of the former president all day long, even as we are critiquing, quote unquote. So I just would love to kind of understand better about how we focus more attention, particularly for the young generation that's feeling a whole lot of despair, so much so that they don't want to be here anymore. And so what does it say for a society when the children no longer want to be here?
Riane, just maybe a short thought, if possible, because I have one lap.
Yes, of course.
Coming up on
Well,
time.
I think that the thought is this: there's so much to do that sometimes we feel helpless, but we are not. And I want to remind us all that, in the last 300 years, there has been one social movement, an organized social movement after another, challenging a tradition of domination, whether it's the civil rights movement challenging the so-called divinely ordained of a, quote, superior race to rule over inferior races, whether it's the women's movement, whether it's going back to the Enlightenment. But all of this, whether it's the environmental movement challenging our once hallowed conquest and domination of nature, which at our level of technological development and population, which is a function of the domination system, because women in Africa, there are books and books and books about how women yearn for family planning. But anyway, the point of it is that we have to connect the dots and see that the real struggle for our future is up to us, and it's the struggle of moving from domination to partnership. And we need to really pay attention to these four cornerstones of family and childhood, of gender, of economics, and of story and language. And everything that we have gained has been, as Margaret Mead said, due to a once usually small and unpopular group of women and men who saw that something better is possible.
Absolutely. So thank you so much. So I'm putting a link to the Google Doc that has the bios for Belvie and Riane. And I will be, if you all send me those two poems, I will copy and paste them and put them there. People were asking for the poems. So if you can send me copies of that, be great. And also, Riane, I will add a link to the Scientific American article after we're off air. So just give me a couple minutes for that, and you all should have access to that document.
And great. Will there have access to the chat? I haven't had the opportunity to really read the comments in the chat, but will you get?
Yeah. Can I ask somebody at the OLLI team to make a copy of the chat that we can send to Riane and Belvie? Because there really are some very thoughtful. Thank you so much to everyone.
We can do that. Also, when you open chat, down at the bottom, there's three dots over to the right. And if you click on that, it says save chat.
Got it. I just saved it, Belvie.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I love it.
I wanted to, our last, I wouldn't question, maybe it's thoughts. Deidre asked that we talk about standing up for life and safety of all civilians in Gaza and Israel, and this calls for humanity and courage from U.S. citizens. I think President Biden said that we're at an inflection point. I think that's right. And I wanted to just give a moment before we end our time together, as you think about this crisis, if there's anything you would like to share with folks to help think about how we can situate ourselves to just these extraordinarily difficult and really horrific circumstances.
Well, I would just like to say, and I've been thinking about this a lot, because 20 years ago, I was in Cyprus as part of a social healing journey that Judith Thompson and the then president of IONS, had put in place. James O'D. 23 years ago, I was in Cyprus with Israeli and Palestinian peace activists from South Africa, people in Ireland, from Ireland. And one of the things that we needed to do in that setting was to have a session, a holding session for the Israeli and Palestinian activists there, because their tears, their heartache, their heartbreak was that nobody recognized them. They've been working together for 10, 15 years across all of these divides. But when the conversations occurred, they were never a part of it. Their example their wisdom. And so we sat with them and we held them and we cried with them. So I'll just leave it there.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Belvie. And Riane, we're just at time, so but I want to make sure you have an opportunity to speak to this as well.
Well, as a Holocaust survivor, it's a difficult thing because if the United States and eventually England and other countries hadn't stopped Hitler, I'd be dead. I mean, it would be that simple. And so it is a very complex issue, but I can't help thinking of a woman who hid in a bramble bush as Hamas was killing these love and peace people of the festival that she had attended. And what she said is it was clear to her that Hamas didn't see us, she said, as human beings. And that is the domination in-group versus out-group dehumanization of people. And we've got to stop this. But she also ended by saying that we have to address this with love at the same time that we defend ourselves. It's not so simple. It's not so simple at all. But the people who suffer, of course, are like the people at the festival, like the civilians in Gaza, who were betrayed, not only by Hamas, but by all the surrounding Arab nations. I'm an immigrant. I was absorbed. Immigrants are usually absorbed, and they didn't. They kept it in Gaza, in Lebanon, as really political footballs, not as human beings. And they're betrayed by their leadership now as well. So it is a very complex situation, and we have to address it with understanding of the dynamics of it and make sure that we change leaders so that leaders can talk with each other. And really, Hamas has said, their aim is push all the Jews into the sea, destroy the state of Israel. That is not going to work. I think that we need to change our leaders and be very careful in this country whom we elect.
Absolutely. Well, someone wrote in the chat that we need 90 minutes, and I agree. So if we ever get a chance to do this again, we'll definitely extend our time, but this has been extraordinary. I put in the chat again the link to the Google Doc. So again, give me like maybe a couple of hours to add some additional information. You'll always have access to it once you've clicked on it, and that will have their bio as well as the poems once I get them from Riane and Belvie and other resources about their work. Thank you so much. It is so beautiful. I hope both of you get a chance to read the chat, because it's so many lovely comments about what this meant for people. So all my gratitude.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for just.
And I want to thank you both so much, and all of you who came. And remember, it's in our hands. We have to make our voices heard.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone.
And thank you to the tech support group for
yes.
having this go so smoothly.
Wonderful.